Hello friends, welcome back to my channel again. Today let's explore some beginner friendly classic books. First of all, I consider myself a beginner in this genre because I haven't read much of classics. I have always been intimidated by the classic books because I have always assumed that they are going to be dragging, they are going to be boring and difficult to read, and they are going to take forever to get to the point. But over the years, I found that it is not the case. I have learned that they can be lovely and they can be fast paced and they can become your all time favorite books just as a whim, just like all the books that I'm going to show you today. So without further ado, let's get into the recommendations. So the first classic is one of the first classics that I have ever read, and I am forever thankful that I came across this book. And I have never seen people recommending this book in YouTube. I've never saw any booktuber speaking about this book, but this is my all-time favorite now, and I beg you to check this out, and that is Candid by Voltaire. This is written by a French philosopher, and he was kind of always hated the kind of philosophy that was going on during his time, where they say that optimism is everything, we are living in the best world possible, and he disagreed. So he wrote a comical story about his perspective, and he done it very beautifully. So the story follows Candid as such and his series of misadventures like fighting a war, being arrested, nearly getting burnt at the stake. He is kind of in search of his lover, and it's the journey that we are going to see. It is fairly short, and the language is like for a children's classic, but it is not a children's classic. It's highly philosophical, and it's almost fun. You don't worry about the philosophical part. It is going to keep you entertained, and you can read this book in 1 hour. And I think that this would be the best start if you haven't read any classics ever in your life. So the next recommendation is not kind of a book recommendation, but an author recommendation, and that is Jane Austen. And you can just pick any of her books and you will never go wrong with it. I have read her Pride and Prejudice and Northanger Abbey, and both of this I can vouch for. Her language is kind of very simple, and she writes mostly romances, so it is going to be very cozy time. And it also talks about the social structure of that time. And even though it is written hundreds of years before, it still speaks to you. You can still relate to the characters, you can still love the characters. And I have always loved Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy from Pride and Prejudice, and I also loved Catherine from Northanger Abbey. She's such a quirky character. So Northanger Abbey actually is kind of a satire for Gothic literatures. This heroine is very much obsessed with Gothic tales, so she kind of imagines things that are not real even, and she tries to create drama in her own life. This is about her. And Pride and Prejudice is, as you already know, it's about Bennet family, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy, their love story. One is prejudiced, one is too pride, and the story is so magical and very, very good to read. The next book I want to tell you about is one of the most captivating books in the classic literature. And as a kid, when I was in my childhood, I always wanted to read a lot of vampire, and I wanted to know the history behind the vampires, and I have always wanted to read Dracula by Bram Stoker. So this book, as you all might know, it's about the vampires, bats and everything. And this is a story, even though it is written way back in time, it is very, very captivating. It is written in a format of diary entries and letters to the characters. So there is no narration here. You just kind of flipping through someone's diary or someone's letters. It was so very fast paced, and it is terrifying at times. That will keep you reading more and more of what is going to happen, and you will keep on turning the pages and you will love this book. It is very atmospheric. It is the father of all the Gothic literature, and if you are someone who like Gothic vibes in a book, then this classic is for you and you will not be disappointed. The next classic is something that you might have heard a lot about because this is a kind of staple, and that is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley wrote this, I think, when she was 16 years old and she was a getaway from the family. She basically invented science fiction from this, I have heard. And here in this story, we follow Victor Frankenstein. Frankenstein is the scientist, not the creature. And he creates the creature, and with all the different body parts of different human corpses, and forms a one single creature. And after creating him, he kind of feel very bad about himself, and he hates that creature and just abandons him. Something happens and the creature kills his sister, and it is kind of a battle between good and bad, and who is really bad? Actually, the creature is bad, or the monster who has created the monster is bad. So that is the battle that is going to happen in this book. There are so much of good commentaries about humanity, and what makes us human is what this book talks about. I feel like that is something everyone should read, and this is a great book to hang out with. So you might get skeptical about this recommendation because this is a kind of chunky book, and I'm saying that it is beginner friendly still because the language is very good, and I spent almost a month reading this book, but it was the best time of my life. The book that I'm talking about is Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. So this book follows Raskolnikov, and he kind of commits a murder for the sake of committing a crime and see if he can get away with it. So that is the storyline, and we see the repercussions of all his actions after that. And you literally can live in his mind. That is how I felt while reading this book. I was living inside Raskol's mind, and I was feeling the torment, I was feeling the anger, I was feeling the helplessness. Everything was very beautifully written. This is one of the book that is unlike anything else you might have ever read in your entire life, because this is the first time I'm reading a Russian classic literature, and this was something, really something. This is a story that is going to stick to you for a longer time. Even if you don't like the story, it will stick to you. It has such a power, and I feel like anyone can read this. It is very simple and it is very neatly written, and I hope you love it because I loved it, and this is the proof. The next book that I want to talk to you about is my recent read, and I loved it so much. I read it in a single sitting, and I could not think of anything else while I was reading it. I wanted to finish it. I wanted to know what it is about. I wanted to know what happens at the end. And this is a kind of a modern classic, if you may, because it came around 1940s or something, and the book is My Cousin Rachel by Daphne du Maurier. I loved reading Rebecca from her a while back, and I wanted to explore more of her work, and I decided to pick My Cousin Rachel the next, and it was the best decision of my life. The story follows Philip, and whose cousin Ambrose takes care of him because he's an orphan. And Ambrose is kind of dedicated to spend his life taking care of Philip. But one day, what happens is that he cannot take the cold of England, so he travels down south and to Florence, I think. And there he meets a girl called Rachel and gets married. He keeps on sending Philip letters, but under some suspicious circumstances, Ambrose dies, and Philip is convinced that Rachel is the reason for his cousin's death. But meanwhile, Rachel is coming back to England, to their place, and while spending time with Rachel, he's finding himself drawn to her like a moth to a light. And he is, despite all the red flags, he is not able to see anything else. And he is still trying to figure out if Rachel has killed Ambrose. And that is what you will find at the end of the book. It is so thrilling, and the writing style is so beautiful. Since it is written much recently, you can read the English very easily. You will relate to it. It is fast paced, and there's something for everyone in this book. It is very, very good. Please do check it out. If you're reading anything from this pile of books, this should be it. I loved it so much. How can this list be complete without a book from my favorite author of classic literature, that is L.M. Montgomery? And I want to recommend you the famous Anne of Green Gables. I'm recommending this book from her because this is much beginner friendly, and there is a series of books in this Anne of Green Gables world, and it gets more tense and more serious as the story progresses. But this story is so light-hearted. It is about a girl, and she is kind of being adopted by a family, and that family actually wanted a boy, but some miscommunication happens, and this girl ends up there. And they never wanted this girl, but ended up loving her. And it's all about her life in Green Gables, and it's all about her making friends and her making rivals, and it was all such a good time. And one thing that I want to mention here about Montgomery is she writes nature like so well. You will feel like you are literally inside the picturesque commentary that she's making. You will literally feel that you are inside the Canadian brook. You will feel like you feel the warm and the cold air, and you will just feel everything that she's writing. She's such a captivating writer. If you haven't read any Montgomery books, please do check out any Montgomery books. I'm not biased about any books about her, but I'm recommending Anne of Green Gables because this is the most famous one of hers. The next book is also a book that is kind of children's classic, and the book is Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Brunette. So this story follows Mary, and she lost her parents in India and she is being sent to England to her uncle's home, where she is kind of very lonely, and finally she discovers a forgotten garden, literally, that was being neglected, and she takes care of the garden blooms, and she befriends someone called Dixon, and there is a ill cousin Collins, and he also is getting better after she comes there. She literally heals the garden, the friendship, the Colin, and her uncle who's still grieving the death of his wife, and it was so wholesome. This is also supposed to be very simple and easy to read. I loved my entire time. These kids will teach you so much more about life than you ever will experience. The next book is for you guys who are afraid to commit to reading a book, entire book. This is a kind of short stories, and they are perfectly classic, and they are the Grimm's Fairy Tales by Brothers Grimm. So this is a collection of fairy tales. If you are someone who likes cottagecore fairy tale stories, this is something you can read. You can read just one chapter and just be done with it. And these have so much magic and whimsy packed into this book. You will just feel transported into the kingdoms of England and everything, which is my favorite trope to read. I love fairy tales, and Rumpelstiltskin is my favorite fairy tale. I love Rapunzel and so much more. There are so many stories that I have always loved and I always constantly go back to. I read this during winter time. I have always connected fairy tales to winter, so this is the time that I read it. If you are trying to dip your toes into classics, check out the Grimm's Fairy Tale. The last book that I want to recommend you is, I feel like, is the least beginner friendly book because it is dealing with intense topics and it can get very serious at times. And the book is 1984 by George Orwell. This is a very famous book, a dystopian novel about totalitarian governance, and where there is personal freedom is non-existent. People are stripped of their personal freedom, and whatever you think, you speak, you do, everything was seen or governed by the governance. And there is literally nothing you can do without the knowledge of the government. At one point, one guy turns up against the government because he doesn't like it. So what happens with him is what the book is about. If I say much about this book, it will spoil it for you. It is really well written. The story will make you think about a lot of political things that are still happening in our society. And this is a book that everyone must read. I am recommending this book right and left to everyone to read it. And this is one of the best classics that I've ever read. But just take it with a pinch of salt that this book might be a little serious and rough at times. So that is pretty much it, guys. I have already talked about all the books that I wanted to tell you. These are most of the classics I have read, and I am not a classic book reader so much. If I read it, I really love it, and that is all the books that I've told you about today. Please do recommend me beginner-friendly classic books, or if you have found any classics that is worth your time, please do mention it in the comments. I would love to know. And as always, do comment on my videos. That is making me really happy, and I want to chat with you guys and interact with you about books, and that is the best time of my life. So until I see you in the very next video with the bookish content, keep reading. This is Sushmita signing off.